All right, welcome to the ASP.NET Community Stand-Up. Today I'm joined by Garret London, who's a Technical Enablement Architect at Postman. Welcome, Garret.
Thanks for having me, John.
Yeah, so great. I'm really excited about this. I will confess, I kind of do file new project. I turn on OpenAPI support. I use the API, or I use the web, UI that's kind of handy for testing my APIs, and I feel like I'm just scratching the surface. So you reached out. I'm really excited to kind of go a little deeper and learn more about OpenAPI.
Great, yeah, I'm excited to show it, and great example of a cold outreach turning into a great live stream. So
there you go. Yeah. So before we dig in, so you're a Technical Enablement Architect. What does that mean?
Sure. So previously, I was a software engineer working on .NET Core Web APIs in mostly financial services, and I was utilizing Postman very, very heavily, giving internal presentations, productivity stuff like I am doing now. And I saw Postman had this role, Technical Enablement Architect, and basically we are inside of the field services organization or the sales organization, and we just solve complex problems for customers. So it's across tech stacks, it's across frameworks, etc. So it's a really exciting job because we pretty much get to do something different every day.
Awesome, cool. All right, well, take it away. Where do you want to get started?
Let's just dive right into Visual Studio. I would hate to bore anybody with any presentations. I will share a few things though. Let's grab my screen.
While you're doing that, I'm just always overwhelmed. We've got people joining from all over the world. It's so fun to see. It's amazing. We've got, I don't know, I feel like I'm hanging out with all my friends from around the world today. So this is neat. Okay. There we go. So a couple of things. Can you click on the hide link down at the bottom?
Yes.
I don't know if anyone else notices that, but that always drives me crazy. And then I will switch us to picture-in-picture so we get a little more. Okay.
Awesome.
Yep.
So you're probably all familiar with either the startup or the program CS, depending on which .NET version you're running. I'm actually just going to create a new project and go directly to the ASP.NET Core Web API. Will not be creating this project. I just want to highlight one thing, and that is Microsoft's OpenAPI support out of the box, right? And you may not notice this because it's automatically checked, but this is actually what determines whether the project comes with the extension methods on the service collection and the application builder. Use Swagger UI and add Swagger Gen. So maybe, John, you want to touch upon why Microsoft decided to incorporate that into the project template?
Yeah, and I'm giving my best kind of memory and recollection. I don't have the official kind of word on it, but basically there have been NuGet packages out there that enable that support like for a while. And people were just kind of like always, it was sort of a best practice. Like, okay, now go get this NuGet package and turn it on. And a lot of time when there's a package like this, like I remember they reached out to the developer and said, hey, is it cool if we enable or if we include this? And so actually, if you click on the project name or the project, so like, yeah, so you'll see in there swashbuckle, blah, blah, blah. So those are, and you've got some others added in, right? But those are the, that's the swashbuckle package. That's an open source project. And so it's just included in the templates. And I'm not sure they kind of like why it's, like all the deep kind of reasoning to it. But I feel like, and correct me here, maybe we can talk a little bit more. OpenAPI used to be called Swagger, and it's a definition for APIs. REST APIs, I believe. I mean, only REST APIs, or?
Great question. So OpenAPI is a specification that is language and framework agnostic that represents your endpoints, your models, etc. Right? There's others, and OpenAPI is just a specification language. And so when it comes to other specifications, you may think of GraphQL schema definition language is just another way of representing your API. JSON schema or async API are just more ways of representing APIs that is language agnostic, right? And so Swashbuckle is the code generation side from .NET Core, producing that OpenAPI specification.
It's cool to me because like this is an example of you can go and you can write all these, like it's a specification. You can go and write this by hand, right? You could create,
Yes.
Here's all the API endpoints and all that, and you probably get something wrong, and then you have to manually update it. So it's pretty cool that ASP.NET Core knows my app. It knows which endpoints it's exposing, so it can basically go through and using the Swashbuckle, and it can kind of compile that all together.
Yeah,
right?
and you'll see throughout the talk, we expose a ton of different options. So I've left that not expanded for now, but that you bring up a really great point. Is you can actually write the OpenAPI specification by hand and use, for example, server-side code generation or client-side code generation to create API clients or to create server stubs, right? And so I actually want to pull up a few slides quickly that will go over how Postman kind of views the life cycle, right? Don't worry, there's only 2 slides. Should take a minute. Postman really focuses on the producer and the consumer life cycle. And maybe in the .NET Core world, I don't know how much of us are full stack engineers, but I focus on the producer side from a .NET Core Web API perspective. So you see the define stage, right? We're starting to realize we even need an API. We're designing that, whether we're designing in OpenAPI, YAML, or JSON, or we're defining in .NET, you still need to define those endpoints and models, right? We get to developing, testing. Obviously, most of that happens within Visual Studio in the unit test, integration test project, et cetera. And then we kind of get to more of the deployment side. So we're going to touch upon a ton of the producer side in Visual Studio, outside of Visual Studio, as well as how do you make it more productive for your consumers when you provide an OpenAPI specification to them, right? And so,
I'm glad you mentioned that. That's always something I wondered about. Like, okay, this is cool. I'm producing a Swagger document and it's some JSON file, and I can use it in my like UI. The web UI is useful to me, but how useful is it actually to consumers?
Exactly. Yeah.
And then I always wonder about like, is there stuff I should be doing that would make it more useful to consumers?
Exactly. I'm sure we've all used client-side code generation and ended up with method names that are like post get weather summary, post get, it's just a huge string, and that's one of the things I'm actually going to show. But this is, you see how the producer and the consumer need to intersect, right? And producers are also consumers. It's a very fun industry to be in. And this is kind of a whole life cycle overview of what it looks like from designing an API on the left here into what happens downstream. And downstream is the most important part. And this all happens outside of Visual Studio, actually. So you'll see that we define the API. And, for example, we used to do it in Confluence pages, define request examples, response examples, because we developed code first, right? So that was kind of our repository for defining what the API is going to look like. And then we moved down to the code perspective, okay? Now, what is being generated from the code? It is the OpenAPI specification right here. Now, if I wanted to switch to what we call a design-led or a specification-led way of developing, all I would have to do is replace this code with specification, because the specification produces the code via code generation. So as long as I end up with a specification, it actually doesn't matter how I design or develop my APIs. So there's benefits to, for example, designing in JSON or YAML. Let's say your product team wants to get super involved in the definition phase. They are probably not going to learn to write C#. All power to them. We would love to see them in Visual Studio, but they may be a lot more comfortable editing YAML files or editing JSON files with more, user-friendly syntax. So getting the OpenAPI specification is actually how you auto-generate documentation. It's how you enforce governance rules, which we'll see. It's how you collaborate via workspaces and collections, kind of the two pillars in Postman that we all know. And the auto generation phase goes beyond collections into docs, mocks, tests, monitors, etc. Right? And so we move from the design phase to the develop phase to the distribute phase very seamlessly once we kind of center around this OpenAPI specification. And I actually want to highlight, coincidentally, there was a recent post in the Azure subreddit that was asking, what is my API development workflow? And this is super interesting because they're curious what an API development process looks like in an enterprise. And they're actually using .NET Core, but they're writing the OpenAPI specification first. So I'm really glad we brought this up because this is a person who's generating .NET Core server stubs from the OpenAPI specification. So you don't have to do code first, right? You can actually design specifications, auto-generate your server stubs, and all you need to do is hook up the business logic to your routes. So this was around, another question about constantly adding models and routes to an already existing spec and then having to auto-generate only the differences between the controllers and models from the newly published specification. So, we had a good discussion, why are you designing the spec and not just writing .NET Core code first is the number one question somebody asked, right? And so you can read through this. It all depends on your level of API maturity, right? If you are involving your product in those YAML specifications, it's a huge benefit to do that. But so I don't want to kind of pin .NET Core as like, oh, you have to go code first. Obviously, we have database first benefits and entity framework, and that's a whole nother discussion. But and
the answer to all these things is usually it depends, right? Like
exactly.
It depends on your organization, the product you're building, how often you're updating, and what how you're versioning, and
exactly. And this is an important point that the original poster makes is the specification is the standard. The spec can be converted into multiple types of servers via languages. Whether you want to integrate with Azure API management is a great place to host your OpenAPI specifications. .NET Server code is just one of the many outputs possible from specifications. So yeah, this is just another perspective that I wanted to highlight on just deciding code first or design first, because just because you use .NET Core does not mean you need to go code first.
I'm getting all kinds of ideas, and I'm forcing myself to not go off into the weeds, but I've got tons of questions on that later.
All right, we should. Cool. So I went over producer consumer lifecycle. Let's start just looking at our program file. I am going to skip a few things just as they relate to things later in the presentation, but the add swagger gen method is part of the Swashbuckle ASP.NET Core NuGet package, right? Standard, comes with no options configured. Let's configure some options like adding servers, right? This is very cool. When you generate a Postman collection, you don't need to fill in the base URL, right? Something as simple as that for your consumers. Defining your Swagger OpenAPI information with the contact and title, etc. Security schemes, you're able to define that your API authenticates via an API key or a bearer token or a basic token, as well as additional security requirements. So we're going to move through this kind of slowly because there's a little bit moving parts, but what we've done is we've actually included XML documentation, and you may be used to seeing only one import of an XML assembly or XML comments. This is because I store my models in a separate C# class library. And so you actually have to get the assembly of the class library in order to import it as well. So keep that in mind. If your XML comments aren't showing up and you host your models in a separate class library, make sure you add the model assembly.
Are those XML comments useful in OpenAPI as well? Do those show up in OpenAPI?
Great question. Yes, they do. I will show that. I will show that now. So
cool.
Let's
learning so much. This is amazing.
Well, yeah, we just started. So all right. So I kind of use just the standard weather forecast template. You see, we've defined some examples here in XML comments. We can define the summary. We can define examples, etc. And you may be saying to me, I don't want to crowd my C# models with XML documentation. Okay, we have another way to do that as well. So let's look at this pretty high level. I'm actually going to launch the Swagger UI. And a quick note about the Swagger UI is if we go to Program CS, we'll see the application builder is adding the Swagger UI when you're in the development environment. And so the question is, okay, I don't have a Swagger UI to provide to customers, right? Let's move my Blazor. I'm doing this in a Blazor server project, coincidentally, but just consider it a .NET Core Web API. So we're in the Swagger UI, but the question is, what happens if I can't expose this in production? I mean, I don't even want to expose this in any lower environments because my lower environments are accessible via public gateway URL. Now I have this OpenAPI specification. And what do I do with it, right?
So let's stop for a second, because for people that are totally new to this, we've been looking at code that defines an API in ASP.NET Core, and then so that's all the kind of back end stuff. And then what you just showed, you launched it and you navigated to Swagger and you showed a web page, and that's the Swagger UI, and then you clicked on the link and that brought up the JSON, which is actually the Swagger spec, right?
Yeah, so I didn't want to give it too much away, but I have in my API controllers folder a weather controller. And this is just a .NET Core controller, with the proper routes and, a few attributes and obviously some summaries and additional XML documentation. Now, like we talked about before, at runtime, the add swaggergen extension method will auto-generate from my controllers and my models, right? Because my model is specified in my post request. It will generate a swagger.json file for me that is exposed via the Swagger UI. So let's do that again. I may have moved too fast, but I started the project up, which means that in the background, that add swaggergen method is doing magic. When I go to the Swagger endpoint as part of my hosted service, now I see a visual representation of my swagger.json document. And this swagger.json document I just opened here, this is not very friendly to look at. So Swagger UI has built a UI around it, but the question remains, what do we do when we can't expose this in production or demo or whatever environments people make up now? What do we do? So yeah, I hope that did that clarify how everything was kind of getting launched?
Yeah, totally. That's
Perfect.
really helpful.
So we have this swagger.json file. And an important thing is that it was generated at runtime, right? I actually had to run the application to generate that document. And when you're making changes to your controller, I have the Swagger JSON file actually being auto-generated in my local startup project, and I'll show you how I do that. Is I actually hold on one second. So I clicked on the wrong project. I actually will use the swashbuckle ASP.NET Core CLI NuGet package, and I use a MS build post build trigger to actually create this Swagger file in my local build directory. Okay. Now you'll see that I have this plain English Blazor Swagger JSON. I have plain English Blazor, swagger.json. So that file, every single time I build my project, is generated at now switching from runtime to build time and compile time, right? So you'll start to see how this becomes beneficial in a minute. And this just one line right here, swashbuckle ASP.NET Core CLI NuGet package allows you to do this in a post-build trigger. So let's go back to my controller, and I'll go to my let's go to the swagger.json file. I can see that I have a summary here, right, on my API weather get endpoint. If I navigate to my controller, I can see my API weather get endpoint right here has a summary get weather forecasts. That aligns with get weather forecasts right here. And so let's just change this to forecast. And I've modified something in my controller. Now my swagger.json file still says forecasts. So this is not updated, right? Because my XML comments are right here. There's a difference. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to rebuild the project. By rebuilding the project, it's going to target my unit test project as well. And you'll see I have one change on the weather controller after I finish building the project. Unless something changed since last night, you'll see that my swagger.json file is now at build time, compile time, is now edited according to what I changed in my controller. Nice. So if you're familiar with traditional .NET Core Web API development, you make a bunch of changes to your controller, and you add a bunch of stuff, you add routes, you add models, etc. You really don't know how that affects the specification. I mean, you can make guesses, right? But for example, let's try one thing. Let's try the produces response type annotation, and I just want to show you what gets produced. What is it? Status codes.404. Yeah, let's try that one. Okay. So let's show what actually gets produced when I add this produces response type. I'll rebuild, because this may not be what you expect. It actually outputted an error. Sorry. Where are you? May need to supply a type. Let's try generating this. Oh, sorry, I've already defined. Okay, so I've skipped to my next one, but let's go to the error operation filter. So if you see, I've actually got an error when I was generating my specification because I've already added a 404 to my endpoint, and this plays into my next piece where I can define at the endpoint level what I want to add to every single endpoint. So if you look at my swagger.json file, I have response types on every single endpoint that I've configured custom for my error responses. Okay. So I've actually defined an error operation filter that applies on every single OpenAPI operation, and it will actually add 500 and 404 and all my error codes that I returned from my API across all my endpoints, because I want to have a standard way of operating. Let me actually just get rid of this generic 404 and try and rebuild it. I think it was just looking and saw a duplicate 404.
Yeah. Okay.
Perfect. So now if I go here.
Yeah. Okay.
Perfect. So now I have my 404 response that was added with my schema of my error model. But I'm going to actually show you what happens when I don't define the type of my 404, because usually you'd expect like a 404 just doesn't return anything in the body, is what I would expect. But let's look at what Swashbuckle does when it generates this spec. You see that it defines this problem details object where it's nowhere in my code, but it says that the 404 now returns problem details. So like I said, if I were just without this visual feedback, if I was just editing my controller and I just my endpoint returns a 404 with no data, that's correct, right? I define my producer's response type, that's correct, but it's not in the underlying specification. It generates nonsense, right? So definitely have to be considerate on what you're including in your controller and your what annotation attributes you actually use. But yeah, that was, I guess, a good segue into the operation filter. Is you can actually define, and this relates to the standardization of your APIs, right? Your 404 responses should not be different across endpoints. Your 403s should be returned for the same types of things. Your 401s, etc. So this applies to every single operation that you define, which is an operation is a route, right? Now, I also have a custom document filter, which applies to the entire document. And so you see this custom extension that I add, x-postman.custom. I scroll all the way down to the spec. You see that it's added on the entire document. So that's the difference between the operation filter and the document filter in terms of adding custom things to your OpenAPI specification. And that's actually set up in the add swagger gen as well, in the operation filter and document filter extension methods, where you can pass in a generic type of a implemented iDocument filter.
Okay, so let me make sure I followed that. So you can set up two different kinds of filters. One is an operation filter that you can apply to specific operations, and then the document filter is kind of the broadest level, right? That's going to apply to the entire Swagger document.
Correct. The operations for every endpoint, the documents for the document. Sorry.
Okay. So this example you've got here with the document filter, you're adding a custom header. Is that just kind of like, here's a sample of what you could do, or?
So this is actually not a header. It's what's called an OpenAPI extension. And let me see if I can pull something up quickly. So OpenAPI extensions, for example, I'm just gonna pick this because it's I know it the best. But for example, when you work with Lambda functions in AWS, there's extensions that you can expose through the OpenAPI specification that actually allow you to provision infrastructure. Like, for example, an API gateway integration object. You may be familiar with a Lambda integration pointing, from an API gateway. So,
Nice.
So the OpenAPI extensions are actually, like, you can build, obviously there's tooling around OpenAPI specifications. You can build, your own extension parser and add your own extensions. But this is how you can kind of integrate with all the other platforms out there that take in extensions from your OpenAPI specification into their downstream services.
I totally didn't know. So I just searched this up, and they also have support for this in Azure Functions as well.
Oh yeah.
Super cool. Okay.
Yeah, so yeah, the OpenAPI extensions is just adding a custom attribute to your specification, and where you upload that specification into any tool that you use in your development process, check and see if they expose these or take in these OpenAPI extensions, because they're very cool. One thing we didn't talk about was model annotations. So for example, like ASP.NET Core exposes through system component model those, for example, URL, email address, phone number, credit card, or some common ones. And these will actually translate to your OpenAPI specification as well. So if I go to my models and I go to website, you can see that the format's a URI, okay? I want to point out another important thing from the producer side. You notice how we actually have examples defined on the models in XML, and we have an example defined in code. And I want to show you how that works, because it's kind of the same type of thing, but two different approaches. So if I go to the Swagger UI again, and I click on Get Weather Forecast, this returns a list of weather forecasts, okay? If you notice my response body is a list with pretty specific examples, right? How do I get this to not return string in 0, 0, right? The default values. This is actually being taken from my weather example defined here. You see my website is .net, Microsoft.com, etc. Here, my summary is test 1. You see that it all lines up with what's being displayed in my response, okay? That is a lot better for your consumers than just seeing a bunch of random, strings, whatever, in terms of consumption and ease of, we call it time to first call. Another thing is time to value, right? Time to first call is great because, okay, they can generate a token, they can bypass the 400, fluent validation errors you have and whatnot. But time to value is when they understand the business context of your API. And they are able to make not just one request, but subsequent requests to generate value from that API.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. And so you wrote that class with your example.
Yes.
And that's included in the API, or is that?
So this examples provider is part of the Swashbuckle ASP.NET Core filters interface. And okay. they recommend that you do this via XML documentation, but I actually prefer to do it this way. Is in my program file, I'm kind of skipping over all the stuff, but until we get to it, obviously. But in the program file, I have add Swagger examples from assembly of. And so what this does is my weather examples, like I mentioned in the XML assembly, the weather examples class is in a different project than my program. So I actually have to add the Swagger examples from the assemblies of this file, which is in my shared folder. And the shared folder has an implementation for iExamples provider. So what Swashbuckle, the filters NuGet package does is it actually scans the assemblies for any implementations of iExamples provider. And then what it will do is it will see, oh, you have an example defined for a list of weather forecasts. Let me go through your controllers and see, oh, a list of weather forecasts is being returned by this endpoint. So I already know in my Swagger UI what I want to display as a response for this endpoint. Not the examples that are default from the classes, but actually what the producer has defined is an appropriate response for this API to be returned.
Okay.
Now,
nice. Okay.
Let's shift over to the create and see the difference. Okay, I have a website, bing.com, and I have a different summary. So how does this work? This is a great example of the XML documentation. Okay, so if I go to the model, you see that my example here is bing.com. My summary is the summary that is now in my Swagger UI. So like I said, there's two different ways to actually specify example requests and example responses. One is by implementing this iExamples provider interface and then adding the correct assemblies. The other one is adding examples in the XML documentation. So you see, this is the summary for the weather, and then this is the summary for the weather. Whereas this summary is test 1 and test 2 because I defined it in my examples.
Let me guess why you prefer the second case, because it's actual code that's going to compile, and it's like as opposed to a string, right?
Yeah. So for example, I had to hard code this date as an example.
Yeah.
Whereas I can actually just use like date time, for example.
Yeah. Okay.
Or I can do a GUID.NewGUID to represent that my IDs are not, database incremented; they're just GUIDs. So it's you're also able. This helps a lot with lists because the IDs look natural, right? The list 1, list element number 2, list element number 1. You can make it a little bit more personable, and I find that integrating with an API is already hard enough, right?
Yeah.
You have to deal with generating the tokens. You have to deal with bypassing 400 fluent validations, whatever. The last thing you want to have happen is your consumers copy paste string int, and then having to manually change those values
Right.
to not random values, but they're basically guessing on what they think your API accepts. And part of this is, okay, it's great and all, but the benefit of this is it's just more asynchronous. I think the more we can allow people to have less synchronous communication via API integration between the producer and consumer is better. And the Open API specification is just the conduit to asynchronous work. And that's why I guess the part I'm focusing on right now is amplifying the spec with the correct values and with the correct extensions, with the correct model attributes, with the correct examples. And once you have the spec, the world's your oyster. And I think that's, sorry, go ahead, John.
Well, one thing that you went by kind of quickly. So we're looking at like adding full examples. One thing that you talked over, but I'm not sure people are as aware of, in your model class, you can put your data type annotations on those. And there's a bunch of data type annotations that, like are super useful to put on. Like, so there you've got date time, but you mentioned like you can do
string
URLs. Yeah, you can do you can do email, you can do
so
stuff, right?
Let me show you. I'll show you a little bit. So there's email address, there's phone, there's URL. One thing I really like is if I can fix that, is string length, right? Let me show you how string length maps in that Open API specification right here. Max length, min length on string length taken directly from my data annotation on my model. So yeah, great point on, I may have skipped over that. Required annotation, right? That's another thing that reflects in the Swagger UI, in the schema, you see that temperature Celsius is required with the asterisks. You can also see all the summaries that I gave in the Swagger UI as well, my examples, etc. And it's funny, actually, the example here is Bing, but the example value is .NET. So interesting how they honor it in the example value, but not the schema.
Yeah.
So that was really from the producer side of like how to configure controllers, how to configure models, how to configure the program, how to add extensions. I mean, we went through a bunch of stuff, but how to produce a quality Open API specification. And obviously, our favorite phrase is it depends, but it does depend on your business. It does depend on the maturity of your API program. It does depend on the maturity of, your stakeholders and to how involved they are in the process. But it's very exciting to see what you can do when it comes to producing the Open API specification. Go ahead.
Well, so there's one thing that I noticed kind of lights up in there's the authentication stuff, and you talk some about the authentication. Is there more like how can I create an API that's easy for consumers to understand the authentication side of it?
Great question. So this is a perfect segue into Postman, because ultimately, where are they calling those APIs? You may be sending a Postman collection, you may be adding them to a team workspace, but what do they do after that? Is there, good steps? Is there variables, etc.? So let's move into Postman. I am going to touch on the producer side in Postman first. And then we will be discussing all of that fun stuff on the consumer side, but it's important to see how you actually craft the Postman resources to empower your consumers. And I'm sorry if you thought that the talk was going to be productivity in terms of keyboard shortcuts and all that fun stuff, but when we think about there's this concept of the 10x developer, right, in the world. And and those types of people, they amplify the people around them as much as they learn to be productive in their own atmosphere, right? So Postman is a tool for collaboration, productivity, and governance, which we'll see. But as the producer, you have a responsibility to your consumers to make that headache of integration a little bit less painful.
So as we go into Postman, can we talk just generally, like, so Postman's a company you work for, and they have both free and paid tools, right?
Yes, they do. Most of what we will be demoing today is free. The only thing I believe that we'll be showing is the on the paid tier is the enterprise governance side of things, which is focused on the design phase. Cool. So everything after the design phase is pretty much good to go. So I do want to highlight. So we're in the collections tab right now. Let me just close everything down. So close everything down. Okay. So in Postman, you're familiar with a workspace. It's where all the work gets done. It's a repository of Postman assets. It can include environments, mock servers, collections, APIs. But you may be more familiar with collections. Collections can be auto-generated from OpenAPI specification. And I'll actually touch upon later how you can convert a collection into an OpenAPI specification. But for now, we're actually going to switch over to the APIs tab. And if you're not familiar with the APIs tab is what we call the API builder, which allows you to basically build APIs, share them, collaborate on them, hook them up to source control, CI/CD, etc. So for the next few, let's look into the producer side of Postman, and then we'll dive right into the consumer side of Postman. So producer side, you'll see that we've hooked up the API to Git. And this is very interesting because what does it mean for an API to be hooked up in Git to Postman? I have a Git repository. And if you look, Postman has identified in my repository, there's a JSON file. In my solution, there's also a JSON file. Mm-hmm. So Postman will look through the repository, find all the specs. We support multi-file. We support, JSON and YAML. It will look through all the specs and import it. So the first thing you do when you're actually creating a new API, I tried documentation. It will ask you whether you want to import it from a repository or you want to design the spec manual. So for example, I can, like we were talking about before, I can write YAML here, right, in the editor. Obviously, we're not talking about that right now. So Postman does support both design first and code first, but we're only going to be focusing on the code-led side of things. So we have the spec. It was automatically taken in from the source control integration. That's configured very easily through OAuth into your GitHub organization. We also set up test and automation, which I'll go through a little bit later, but that's the CI/CD part. So if you're excited about Postman CI/CD, then stick around. So we have this swagger.json file. You'll also notice that we're on a master branch. And why is there a master or a Git connection in Postman? There's a Git connection because every time I push a change to my controller, let's try this out. So let's add back that S. Now, producer side, every time I make a change, chances are I'm running my unit test. That's why in my unit test, I've configured the swashbuckle generation. So I'm running my unit test. I'm making sure that what I do is even good to push, right? If my unit tests don't pass, nothing else really matters. So, okay, that's why. So I actually didn't push the change. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to push the change with the removed S that was on my local commit. So, okay. Perfect. So we see in my Git changes, I've removed the S. The specification over here still has the S, right? Mm-hmm. And let's actually, and I've made sure that the controller change is mapped appropriately to the swagger.json. And obviously this all happens on a feature branch. For this demo, I'm just going to do it on master. But let's say fix summary on weather. Yeah. Okay. So let's commit that. And so I've committed to master. And what do I expect to happen? Somebody's going to need to consume this new version of my API. Now imagine that I changed the model, or I've added a new route, and somebody needs to consume this. So where do they consume it? They consume it in Postman. And if I go to pull changes, you see that the commits from remote have been pulled into Postman. My summary has updated where there's no S anymore, right? And great. So my specification is now in line with what I've changed in Visual Studio pretty much instantly in Postman. And
so this is an example of why you build that JSON file, like you include that in the build step then.
Yeah, that's exactly why I include it in the build step, because here's the thing. You're making code changes. Mm-hmm. If you're not running your unit test before you push to Git, chances are you got bigger problems than just the API mm-hmm. stuff. So that's why I put the post build trigger in my unit test project, because my main startup projects and my class libraries actually don't depend on the unit test project. So if I want to just rebuild without running the swashbuckle stuff, I can just rebuild the main project and not rebuild the unit test project, which would not kick off the MS build post build trigger.
Got it.
So okay. The reason I put it in the unit test project is because your developers are going to be running their unit test right before they push to Git, just to make sure everything's good. So I see that my unit test had passed. I have pushed to Git. My spec is now updated, and now comes I think .NET Core is very cool, but here comes the cool side. So let's go to the API. The definition is what it is. It's going to be changed from code. Let's generate a collection. Okay. So if I click on this collection, add a collection, and generate from definition, I have the options to name my stuff. So weather collection. Okay. I want to generate parameters based on my examples defined in the specification and not the schemas. So that's actually the difference between, hold on. It's actually the difference between the examples here mm-hmm. and the schema defined here. So it's whether you want to use those reusable components or you want to use the example. And so obviously we want to use the example because we've custom defined requests and responses. Another thing is folder organization. You can use tags or paths. Paths will create a new folder per endpoint, which you don't want to do. So use tags. Let's generate this collection. There's an important thing I actually skipped over. Let me do that. So suggest updates to collection when definition changes. What does that mean? So let's analyze this collection. And we'll go back to that. I just want to give a little teaser. Okay, API weather get. If I look at my base URL, that's why I defined the servers, because I don't have to configure anything now. If I didn't define the servers in my OpenAPI spec, I would have to actually go into the collection, go to variables, and this would be an empty slash. So okay. I'd have to set that myself. So
now, question there, you've got that showing localhost. Obviously, Postman needs to be able to, if you want to test it from here, Postman needs to be able to get to localhost. Great
question. So if you're using Postman in the web UI, you actually cannot run localhost requests, obviously. If you're using Postman desktop version, you can run localhost.
Got it.
So great question, because I actually got tripped up on that last night. And I work here. So base URL is defined, okay, but okay, I don't know what's going on. There's nothing here, right? There's nothing. I don't know example. Where are my example responses and stuff? Okay, if I drop down on the request, you see all the example responses that I've defined. And where are these 401s and 403s coming from? It's coming from my error operation filter. Every single endpoint has example errors. Now, you just look at the 500, the description is this is an example of an error response. If I look, this is an example of an error response.
Okay, nice.
If I look at the success for the get weather forecasts, what is returned? It's .NET, Microsoft.com, and test one, and all the stuff that I configured in my examples. If I look at the request body for the create, now it's Bing, now it's what the example XML documentation had. So imagine if you were onboarding to an API and you just saw, string.
Right.
String 0, 0. You have no business context. You have no understanding of the API, right? So that's no fun in my eyes. Okay. So, and it's no fun for your consumers.
Yeah.
So now we're still in the producer view. Okay. Producer has created a collection. And this is where authorization comes in, is allowing users to define, just telling users, here's where you put your API key, or here's where you put your client ID and client secret. For example, if we go to OAuth 2.0 and we go to client credentials, this is where you put your client ID and client secret. So for example, I can use Postman variables for here, client ID, define at the collection level, and leave them blank for my consumers. All my consumers have to do is put in the client ID, and then the authorization tab actually will regenerate authorization every single request you send automatically. So you don't have to generate this bearer token and then paste it in the authorization header of here every time, right? You don't have to do that. You define authorization at the collection level using authorization code flow or implicit flow or basic tokens, etc.
This feels like a nice thing where you can set it up once as the developer of the backend, like producer side, and save your client a ton of time not having to redo that all the time.
Exactly.
On the client side.
Exactly. And this is it's actually something we see a ton in the public API network. So if you're not familiar with the public API network, I'll just 30 seconds. Huge companies, WhatsApp, whether it's Salesforce or whatnot, are getting tens of thousands of views and ultimately API calls on the public API network, where they're able to edit their workspace to be a public workspace.
Oh, okay.
And with the public workspace, when you define that authorization, that applies to every single forked collection. And so now, what is a forked collection? We're in the producer side, okay? Mm-hmm. What I'm going to do is I've created a collection and I have a specification and I don't have any more changes to make. So what I'm going to do is first, I'm actually going to push this collection to Git. And the collections are actually stored in Git as well, which is very cool. So let's look at the diff between the collection. Obviously, the collection was just added, so there's a ton of changes. But let's just go back to source control and then do add weather collection. You see that I'm just going to push the master. Cool. So let's go back to the API.
And you're showing push, just to clarify, but there's already a comment on this. You're showing push to master. It'd be just as easy if you had defined other branches. You could just push to another branch.
Exactly. So you see that I have add weather collection just pushed to Git. So it is literally native Git here. You could create a new branch. You can do a bunch of fun stuff. So the publish functionality actually just got highlighted. And what does this mean? It means that I'm able to define a version for my API. Just increment that version. I can say, add weather collection as my release nodes. Mm-hmm. And I can publish the definition in the weather collection out to my consumers. Okay, so 1.6.2, if I now, hold on. Let's go back here. Let me close this out. Let's go back to that publish button. Okay, so 1.6.2. I just clicked on it and you may notice the view changed. I'm viewing a published version that a consumer would see. So this is actually not the producer side anymore. If you notice, I can edit the API and it brings me to a completely different view where I'm hooked up to source control, I'm hooked up to CI/CD, etc. Oh, for some reason, Postman just quit on me, so gotta reopen that. But maybe I pressed the X button. Cool. So the producer and the consumer side are two completely different views. And let's click on that consumer side again. Great. So what do I see now in the collections tab? I see a fork button. And I'm actually going to fork this to the same workspace, but your consumers could have a separate workspace where they do their stuff. Watch original collection. So the original collection is auto-generated from the specification, okay? I'm watching the original collection as it's changed from the specification in my forked version, and the specification can be synced to the master producer copy. Okay, so let's look at that again. I'm going to, and keep in mind, this is now a consumer fork of the collection. Okay, I am in a producer edit API of the API. So just keep in mind the differences between when we navigate. I'm actually going to change another thing on this specification just to show you what happens. So I'm going to add back that S and just remove. Let's see what to remove. Let's remove the URL. We'll see what happens when we remove that.
I was just going to ask you to make like a real change to the model or something. Right?
Yeah, I figured it's. Cool. I'm doing this all live, so I'm trying to be a little bit more conservative. But,
I'm the same way. Now let's break it.
Cool. So let's look at the perfect. So you see that format URI got removed. Perfect. So let's now commit this. So remove URI annotation. So I've just committed. Let's go back to Postman. And let's pull up our branch. So it takes a few seconds to catch up on the local commits. Let's see. Oh, I blocked myself on the pulled and push. All right, so I've successfully pushed. Let's see how fast it updates.
Now, would I have to manually, like if I had, okay, I see that. So when I open Postman, will it automatically check for that, or do I need to go over and click that button?
Yes, it will. If you don't have the view changes tab open, you'll see master with like a parentheses 1 as in one polling change. It will also keep track of outgoing versus incoming, just like your Visual Studio looks. Okay, so we pulled in that change. And so the question is, I have a definition now. I have that S back and I have my URI removed. But if I go to my collection, let's look at this. I don't have the S. And for example, actually I can't really see how it affects the URI, but I don't have the S, right? So let's go to the collection. What is this? Update collection. Now you see, so the specification and removing that URI actually did not affect the collection downstream, but you see how a change in the specification does affect the downstream collection. So this is keeping a collection in sync with the OpenAPI specification. And now I'm a consumer. Okay, I still see no S. On the producer side, I don't see S, right? So let's pull the changes. Oh, actually, so this is an important distinction, is there's no changes to pull. Why is that? It's because the API is not published, right? So I've made a change to the collection, and I can't publish the collection without pushing the collection to the master. So I'm going to update collection from spec. I'll push this. My collection is now up to date in source control with the specification. Now the publish functionality is highlighted. I'm going to put 3 and then remove S.
So the
Or sorry.
difference you're showing there, to make sure I'm following, one was the change to the Swagger doc, and the other was the change to the collection.
Yes, exactly. So I've published a new version of this API. And now when I go down to pull those changes, now it checks, okay, I'm on version 1.6.2. I see that there's a new published version from the producer. And remember, we're in the consumer side of things now. There's a new published collection from the producer. I need to pull the changes now into my fork, okay? Mm-hmm. Consumer side now. What consumer side, I don't have access to localhost, right? And these changes may not be deployed yet. So what am I in a position to do? I am in a position to continue to develop my front end and work asynchronously through mock servers. So when I click on,
okay.
So when I click on, I like that.
Yeah, the light bulb went on. I was like, why wouldn't you immediately want to publish it? Yeah.
So let's do weather mock, okay? And okay, let's do it. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to save this mock server URL as a new environment variable. A cool thing about mock servers is my favorite thing was when I was testing in Blazor, my loading indicator was simulating a fixed network delay without having to add a task await or task delay. Cool. So you can also make it private and add a specific header. So let's create this mock server. You'll notice there's a URL here. I'm just going to copy it. And now it's created an environment called weather mock. I'm just going to change the URL name because base URL is the name of my URL in the collection. And so now, okay, I can't touch localhost. What happens when I switch to the weather mock in my environments dropdown? The weather mock is now pointing to a Postman, mock.postman.io URL that hosts my specification and my example responses. So you see that the success now looks like this. Okay, so let's try it. Let's get it. Boom. Now I can actually call this API that the producer sent me without having a spun up instance of it running. Okay.
Okay, this is very cool. One thing just to make sure we're circling on is, I don't know, circling back or covering whatever, is this a free Postman feature? Is this a paid part? Or...
Yes, mock servers is a free Postman feature. There is a limit to mock server calls, but it is significantly very high. So
okay, wow.
Mock servers. We've seen so many things be done with them. Right now, I'm sure everybody defines their contract tests as code using like packed and mocks and all that fun stuff. Consumer-driven contract tests can be done only via the OpenAPI specification and, for example, regular expressions on a mock server or regular expressions against example responses, right? That can be configured in Postman. We've seen .NET Core teams actually use Postman mock servers for their like local end-to-end testing or integration testing. So if you don't want to set up like mock or packed or one of those other tools that it's a very heavy lift code-wise to actually define request examples and responses and do DTO builders and response builders and all that stuff in code. That means nobody else who knows how to code can edit it. Another thing we've seen is smoke testing, not with mock servers, but with auto-generating Postman collections is the specification has every endpoint and every model. So ideally, a smoke test is just hitting an endpoint, making sure it's alive. Why does that need to be defined in a .NET Core project? It can be done through CI/CD and Postman collection running. So mock servers, there's a ton of use cases on it. I'm just going to cover kind of what I call the asynchronous front-end development with mock servers, which is really just getting rid of the dependency on your backend teams. Okay, so I know this isn't traditional, but I want to highlight, like for example, if I'm building this data grid or whatnot for weather, and I want to add a new column, I'm just going to add test here, save it, go back. And now my mock server returns the data. So your consumers don't even have to wait for you to be done with your stories to start working on their features.
Wow. Okay. That's slick. That's really nice. So from a consumer point of view, they know something or they're waiting on a feature to be implemented on the back end. They can start working towards that spec on the front end.
Yeah, I mean, and your consumer can influence your collections at the same time, right? Is they can through mock servers power their UI, wait till the tickets get completed, and then make sure that everything syncs up, right? Or make some small modifications. But there's no more, oh, it's going to take 2 weeks to develop this feature, so the front end is now delayed 2 weeks, right? That's not a great thing. So let me just show you. I'm going to launch this application. This is a Blazor server application, and I'll be a little selfish because I'll highlight the amazing ability to not have to use controllers in your Blazor server application. So cool. So what I've done is I've just spun up a in-memory database with Entity Framework that'll store on post. Sorry, not on post. If you go to my weather component, I have an add forecast button that just basically my weather service communicates directly with Entity Framework, not via API, and adds the weather for the day. So you'll see I actually have a mock URL in here, and I have to update that quickly. But let's grab that mock URL from my environments. Okay, let's put in our mock URL here. I have a condition to say like, okay, if it's mocking, use the mock, otherwise use the DB context. So what I do is I'll show you the difference of Blazor server talking directly to Entity Framework, and I'll show you Blazor server directly talking to a mock. So I'm adding directly via Entity Framework. You see that automatically being generated. This is not what my mock server looks like, right? My mock server looks like my example responses on get weather forecasts. So right here again, right? Now, if I click mock, you see that my data now comes from my mock. And so test 1, test 2 is now test 1, test 2. So now I'm switching back to Entity Framework. Now I'm mocking. Now I'm switching back. Now I'm mocking. So maybe it's highlighting how fast Blazor server is, but that's just how easy it is to incorporate mocks into your front-end UI. And it's, okay, Garrett, I'm a front-end developer. I know HTML, CSS. I don't know C#. What do I do, right? Let's look at what I'm doing. Hold on. Let's go to my component, and let's see what happens. So when I get the mock going into my service, and let's collapse this. Perfect. So I'm using REST Sharp. You can use HTTP client and stuff. I just didn't feel like dealing with the factory and everything. I am just, if you don't write C#, this may be a little bit, confusing or whatnot, but that's where Postman comes in. So let's go back to Postman. Let's go to that request. Let's go to code snippets, and you see it's already a C#, REST Sharp. All I did was I highlighted this and just pasted it in my get, and I returned a list of weather forecast after deserializing the response.
I know C#, but I don't mind somebody writing code for me. So that's
exactly,
cool.
Exactly. So
that's nice. Okay. Wow. So we've got some good questions built up. I've got a few. Is there anything more you want to cover before we go to questions?
No, I think I just two things I didn't get to touch upon. Where are you? I didn't get to touch upon the test and automation integration, but it's very easy to configure. I'll do that again. If you go to test and automation, we provide you the CI configuration. All you have to do is copy this to your GitHub Actions and add a secret to your repository secrets in GitHub Actions, and you can now run collections as part of CI/CD. You can do governance linting as part of CI/CD. We didn't do governance linting, but if you're curious, check out the on.net live talk I did almost a month ago about Blazor server and API governance. Check that out. So I think that's the only.
The description.
Yeah, that's the only. And skip the first 25 minutes if you're not interested in Blazor server. but who's not interested in Blazor? So yeah, the test and automation, the CI/CD was really the only thing I wanted to cover. You can see quickly that I've ran a couple governance checks as part of CI/CD. So this is validating my OpenAPI specification.
So governance is kind of the validation step, saying like, hey, you've defined a spec and your updates have not broken that.
Correct. So let me show two things quickly. Is the API governance. This is a enterprise feature. Just so you see that I have an error severity. All my operations my go set team. Let's make a change. So this summary, if I remove it, all my operations do not have summaries. And now my specification that's going to be generated is in violation of my Postman rules. So I've logged into the Postman CLI. You see, let's make this output window a little bigger. I've logged into the Postman CLI. I've taken the swagger.json file that Swashbuckle has created locally. I've ran governance linting against it, and I've gotten an error, all my operations need summaries, at build time. So I can't even run my unit tests. It won't even let me because the build is failing.
Wow.
And so you see, again, all my operations need summaries is now an error. And if I go back to Visual Studio, one of my projects has failed to build. My unit test project failed to build because my Postman API lint, my Postman API lint has exited with status code 1, which is a failure. So that is governance in about 2 minutes. But if you want to see something more substantial, then check out that talk.
Cool. Okay. One of the questions I had, and we've looked at several different things of like versions. Swagger has that kind of drop down. The Swagger UI has it in the upper right corner, and there's the official versioning. What do you have any like recommendations? How do you handle versioning of APIs?
It's a great question because there's versioning across tons of different things, right? There's your version of your endpoint, V1, V2, whether it's deprecated or not. There's the version of your service. There is the version, and the version of the service has to map to the auto-generated version that your CI/CD pipeline might kick off, right? So there's versioning across kind of different providers. What I would say is it's very important to manage versioning at the controller level, is actually defining the versions as part of your routes, right? Breaking changes is kind of breaking changes is irrespective of framework, right? You need to version if you are releasing something that either violates your contracts or violates existing integrations. So versioning is very important there, but it depends like on your CI/CD configuration and your health checks and stuff. What versions do you even expose? So I think, and part of this, the versioning story right now on how the version relating to the API in the API builder relates to the version defined in your service, relates to the version defined on your endpoints. It's not 100% like congruent right now. But that is something that I'm working on, is actually aligning these versions to CI/CD, aligning them to your health check, so that when people click on a Postman version and they view, for example, your health check status that tells them what currently deployed version there is in the environment, those two can match up and they'll be confident that the specification and the collection are in sync. So not all the problems are solved right now with this whole code-led workflow, but the most important thing I think would be getting that specification into the repository, into Postman, getting those example responses, doing all that fun stuff. So yeah, great question about the versioning, because that's something that if you have any ideas on how to solve it, please let me know. Because
I've seen different, like you said. So one thing that I've seen people recommend, and that you mentioned, is like including it in the route, right? So it's just part of the, and maybe you have fully different version route, controllers or whatever, and have that in the prefix.
And Swagger also allows you to define a version somewhere in this, version view. So What I'm pretty sure you can do is loop through all the versions you've specified and actually create a specification file per version. I didn't show that now because it's a little bit more advanced.
Yeah.
And I want to keep it super simple, but
yeah, this is great. I feel like people kind of dive into that as like that. What you've shown is great productivity that you can do right from the beginning and works with any.
Yeah, I think if the question you're asking yourself after this talk is what's next, I think that's the right way to approach it. This is kind of laying the foundation via what do I even include in my startup, right?
Exactly.
Why aren't my models in a different project picking up the XML documentation? So super bare bones.
Okay, well, so we're running short on time. I do want to get some. We had some great questions. Let me start with. Okay, Travis said, you started going down the path how you would expose the specification in production environment to consumers. I think you kind of showed this in Postman. Is there more you want to talk about exposing the production environment to consumers?
Yeah, so personally, I would not expose the Swagger UI to consumers just because think about it, right? Your service is publicly accessible via gateway. And if your Swagger UI is just another, being hosted on your service, that means it's also publicly accessible. So if you're not in the business of let me take that step back. If you're defining all of your example requests, responses, including business logic in your OpenAPI specification, making it super easy for people to integrate, chances are you don't want every single person on the internet being able to see that. And most APIs are just exposed publicly, right? They have to be publicly accessible. So that's the only reason I wouldn't expose the Swagger UI in production or any lower environment, is just because it gives anybody with a URL access to your business logic. The good thing about doing it in Postman is you can abide by the role-based access control set up in your workspace, right? So I can set specific people as viewers. I can do a private workspace for just myself, for a team, or a partner workspace is an enterprise feature, but you can actually collaborate with partners. So let's say you have 10 strategic partners that you really, really want to empower. Create that partner workspace. We have partner SSO and stuff. So bring them all into Postman, which is governed by role-based access control. Your Swagger UI is not governed by role-based access control. It's a public link.
Okay, cool. Let me see a question from VJ about testing APIs from a REST tool and automation.
Sure. So, there's a ton of different ways you can test APIs. If you're familiar with, I would recommend watching one of the Postman testing series, but just a few examples of tests you can write against a response. Response time is less than 200 milliseconds. Let's see if our mock server meets that. Okay, and unfortunately it's 19 milliseconds later, but in the test tab, right, verify the content type, use libraries like AJV for schema validation. This is pretty much a JavaScript sandbox. So whatever libraries you want to bring in, feel free. And there's, we could spend hours and days talking about Postman for testers. But when I run this request, you see that now my tests run. So Postman makes it super easy to also run those tests via test and automation, right? You'll see that for right now, I don't actually have any collection runs for this build. But what I can do is I can run the collection as part of CI/CD, just like I run the linting or governance checks. And so, if I want to run a smoke test, or I want to run, a schema validation test, or a response time verification, I can run that once my build pipeline kicks off in GitHub Actions.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that's definitely something, the GitHub Action integration, something I want to dig more into after seeing this. Okay, question from Zwerg about doing API first with .NET. I think this is looking at you were showing there's the code first or the API design first.
Yeah, so I think API first maybe get a little misconstrued, because API first is a mentality. Some people say, oh, API first is spec first, right? But I view API first as more, how do we get all of the stakeholders that are actually building and consuming these APIs on the same page? What tools you want to use for that is what tool is best for your business, right? We kind of try and build Postman to be super generic because, as you can imagine, we have customers across tech stacks, across dogmas, right? I mean, people are very dogmatic about these approaches, but as we showed in, for example, the Reddit post, people are having success developing the specification and generating server-side code from that specification. People are also having success writing C# like they're comfortable with for decades and auto-generating a spec. So API first is, how do you get your whole organization behind shifting left, right? Shifting governance left to build time, which is what we just did via the swashbuckle CLI. Let me show you just, for example, if I create a new API, and let's do this design first. Let's do the spec first. Let's just continue without a repository. And I will create a new definition using a boilerplate, okay? Now, API first, big part of this is governance, making sure that the rules, you do not violate them. Your organization sets up regular expressions. They set up spectral rules. They set up a ton of stuff. Your spec needs to be in compliance. Let's remove this summary. See what happens. I save the specification. Now I see the rule violation. So it's the same exact thing when you're designing the OpenAPI specification in YAML versus code, right? I remove the specification from my controller. I get the build time error. This is design time, right? I get the design time error when I remove the summary from my design time spec. I get the rule violation. So I think design first, code first, choose whatever's best for your business. I mean, but make sure that the tool you use and the platform that all your consumers are using to ultimately consume your specs supports your use cases.
Okay, makes sense. Let me see. So this was more on the entity or DTO, what mapper are you using, effect on performance? I mean, I guess this kind of goes more, this isn't directly on API stuff, but I don't know, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, you can use auto mapper, you can do manual mapping. There's varying opinions on the performance of that. But when it comes to the specification, if you're familiar with how you traditionally develop a .NET Core Web API, you would use, let's say, an N-tier application where you'd have presentation, domain, or data, or whatever, web tier, whatever you want to call it. And those would expose, let's say, DTOs at the web layer and domain models, and then data model, entity framework models at each tier. The objects that are represented in your specification are only the DTOs, right? They're only the presentation layer. So AutoMapper and mapping profiles kind of don't have anything to do with the OpenAPI specification. But if you're just asking in general, yes, I have had performance issues with AutoMapper in the past, and it was not fun. So if you're, yeah.
But that is a good point here, is before you get too far down the road of defining a public API, you probably do want to think about the DTOs and the actual like model objects you want to expose before building your whole API around entity models, that are directly tied to any framework or whatever, and then you're kind of a little stuck there.
Yeah. I think the worst thing you can do is kind of like define entity models that are mapped tightly to entity framework, deploy to production, have data be put into those models, and then realize, oh crap, I need to change this database structure.
Yeah.
But just like the design phase happens collaborating via comments and stuff in the editor itself, when you're designing the spec first, the design phase still happens when you're doing code first. It's just the design phase happens in whatever tool you like, Confluence or whatnot. You still define what the endpoint is going to look like. What are the response models going to look like? Maybe you don't define things like 404 and 500, which people may think is a little overkill when you're defining your spec, which is why I've included that error operation filter as an automatic, right? But the design phase still happens regardless of whether you're developing in code or designing your spec. It's just when you're developing your code, you're designing what is going to be your code in whatever your team is comfortable with.
Okay. Let me see. I had a question here on authorization. So this is asking about authorization with source control provider. Okay. In our company, we use Postman collections for running integration tests. It can be a useful feature to integrate with internal hosted Azure DevOps. Is that possible?
So I don't believe we have, and I don't know if there's I've never even heard of an on-prem Azure DevOps instance. Is that a thing, John?
I don't know. I wouldn't be shocked.
I wouldn't be shocked. Yeah. I have to look into our Azure DevOps integration. I mean, I know we do GitLab on-prem, we do, GitHub Enterprise and stuff like that. So that's something I need to get back to you about, but great question.
Okay. Well, this has been a ton of interesting information. Lots of comments saying the same thing. A lot of people learning tons of stuff, which is really cool. Is there anywhere you'd want to send people for where to go learn next? What's,
Yes.
You mentioned, as you're bringing that up, you mentioned the on .NET show from about a month ago. I'll include the link to that in the show description. Yeah,
I think the Postman blog is the best place to find pretty much all the information related to Postman. There's a ton of blog posts. Actually, I wanted to share 2 blog posts that I found were pretty helpful. Let's see if I still have them up among all my tabs. This is a great blog post called "How Postman Uses the OpenAPI Specification." So things like validating and syncing during development, right? Making sure that, for example, if your value in your collection doesn't match the value that your spec says, well, Postman will actually fix it for you. Validating API responses that match the schema. Tag organization with folders. What I mentioned before is organizing collections utilizing the spec. And then multi-file schema. So that's a really cool one. And then consistent API designs make people feel outrageously smart because in an organization with hundreds of thousands of APIs, everything needs to be consistent. I mean, it's a nightmare when you're trying to do a search and you have one team decided to expose a get search with query params, and your other team decided to expose a post search with request body. So that lack of consistency, how do you think your consumers feel? And they're dealing with what's supposed to be an enterprise organization that can't seemingly figure out a way to standardize all this stuff. Even things like error responses. Your error response across all your APIs should be the same. I mean, then you're having your client-side teams basically implement against varying error responses in their API clients or client-side code gen. So Postman blog, I mean, there's super, super cool stuff released all the time. If you're interested in GraphQL, just search GraphQL.
We didn't even dig into that too much, but that's some more good stuff. The GraphQL support.
Yeah, the announcing Postman GraphQL client is amazing, right? I can do exactly what he's doing right now is just create a new GraphQL request, use the GraphQL echo server that we have, and it pulls up our Explorer capabilities where now I can pass the arguments and boom.
Nice.
So super easy to integrate with GraphQL, queries, subscriptions, mutations, all exciting stuff. And just another push to bring all of this stuff to more non-developer personas.
Awesome. Okay. Wow. A ton of great stuff. Thank you so much for your time, Garrett. I learned a lot.
Great. Yeah, this was awesome. Thank you for having me.
Cool. All right. Well, we'll wrap up there. I'll include the links in the description, and I may ping you in the future, get you back on and go deeper on some of this.
I would love to.
Okay. All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks.